Let's talk about reactive async. So we had a very good conversation on the break of what happens when you need to call a service and then do something. How does that integrate with your NGRX store? So it's inevitable that we need to perform asynchronous operations in our application. So how do we do this? What is the pattern for this? So we can delegate these asynchronous operations into a service and encapsulate that. When that asynchronous operation is done, then we take the result of that and we put it into our store. Now, where this kind of makes sense, especially in terms of communicating with a remote server, is that when you need something returned back to you on the payload that is relevant to your application. So, for instance, creating something that when you create an item, you're going to get that object back with its ID. You need that. So in that case, you would want to wait for that object to be returned before you put it into the store so that it could hydrate the rest of your application. So in this case, if we focus on stage right, so your stage right over here, that when somebody saves an item from the items detail component, that item is sent up to app component, which then, instead of going straight into the store, goes into the items service for processing, or actually it gets sent to JSON server via the REST API. When that payload comes back, that operation, then we send that onto the store. Now, where this is important is, one, if you need that payload back because it has a new ID on it, or if something crashes and burns, you need to be able to recover from that and figure out what you want to do before you push that state into your master canonical kind of application tree. So I've seen this go both ways, where you'll commit the change locally and then do the remote call. And so the upside to that is you get a snappy kind of front-end experience where I'm just saving this and it's going to go just save this in the background. And for the most part, that works until it doesn't. And then when something goes wrong, then you have to find a way to basically back out of it. The other way that I've seen this is that you submit the request, something happens, and when it comes back, then you commit it to your local state. So there are advantages for doing it either way, and it really depends on your use case. But for this case, that to keep everything in sync, we're going to do our asynchronous operation first. When that successfully completes, then we're going to push it to the store. And so this is what this looks like. And we're going to see pretty much everything that we've been talking about all day kind of come together into a single stunning example. So in the constructor of item services, we're calling this .item store.select items. Now, when we want to load items, so we need to hydrate the connection or the collection initially. We say, we don't have anything right now, but go get us what is available. We are doing a GET request, and from there, when that succeeds, we're mapping that response, and then on the second map, we are creating an action item with type and payload. And from here, then we are terminating this observable sequence with subscribe. And we're using this.store.dispatch, and we're kicking that action up. So as opposed to where select widget was very kind of a short hop into the store of we select this thing, we're just going to dispatch it. In this case, we're adding an additional step into this where it's going into the store, making this call. When it's completed, we're taking this payload, then we're pushing it into the store, and then you're back into this essentially reactive kind of flow that exists. And so another example is what happens when you want to, I think you asked the question, when you want to do an operation, but when you're done, actually just go ahead and get everything back, like refresh the entire collection. So that comes down to just, again, so let's say you want to do an update. You do the update, and then in your subscribe, then you could actually call like load items and then say, I've got this thing updated, but I just want to rehydrate the entire collection. And so if you have something with like high traffic where you're dealing with a collection of items that multiple people could be editing, it may make sense to refresh that on every kind of operation or transformation that you do on the server. I went and updated this thing, but go ahead and refresh it, and I've done that as well. But that all of that asynchronous nature and chaining is encapsulated into a service. And so I'll just show you in the code how this is happening. And so now, load items, we just kind of walk through that. What I'm doing, this is just a pattern that I've seen, that when you have a detailed component that you want to reuse, so it's like I want to create an object or I want to update an object. Essentially the form is the same. The only difference is the object hydrating it, one has an ID and one doesn't. And so I've done it where I've had like a create form and an edit form, and I've toggled them. In this case, I said I want to try something different, and I went with kind of the variation of the upsert method of, if this has an ID, then go ahead and save it. If it does not have an ID, go ahead and create it. So as far as the component is concerned, it's just calling save item. And then in here, we are then figuring out what do we do, and then we're either calling update or create. And this actually bit of logic here is pretty easy to test. You would just simply come up with your mock item, and then you could say if this has an ID, then spy on what method was actually called. So if it did not have an ID, you could say, spy on create item should have been called, or if it does have an ID, spy on update item should have been called. So now by breaking these out into small functions, they're really easy to test. So same thing here, updated item. We're doing a put. In this case, simply because we're dealing with JSON server, for whatever reason, I had to manually set the headers, which you're seeing up here. So I had to set it to application.json when I'm doing any kind of a write operation. But when the result comes back, in this case, I did not need to map anything because I already have a reference to this object. So in this case, I didn't do any mapping. I just said for update, I said, because I have this item, I said, let's just go ahead and create this object and dispatch it. So I was able to chop that out. Same thing for delete. I just need to know really that the operation succeeded. And then for create, on the other hand, I did have to kind of follow along and wait for the operation because I needed that payload because it had the new object with the ID on it. But you really truly can do anything within this service that obviously would need to pertain to kind of this particular problem domain, but any of kind of asynchronous things goes into the service, you do it, and then when it's done, then you dispatch it to the store. Any questions? Shh. Yes?
You do multiple dispatches, so like it's subscribe. Let's say you had an action like request in flight. You wanted to show a spinner. So we make the request in flight. When it comes back, we want to fire request came back, and then with the payload, is it fine to call store.dispatch multiple times in your subscribe callback?
So you want to just dispatch more than one thing?
Yeah.
So sure, you could do something like, so let's say you were basically tracking the state of is something loading or not. And so you just go store, dispatch. It might be, I don't know. Or something like, this is totally off the top of my head, but I mean, you can dispatch multiple events, and because they're not coupled together, then it's totally fine. Make sense? Yes.
Is there an equivalent to HTTP interceptors in Angular 2?
I put a link in there for him.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Man,
And then
Hashtag wingman.
there's a question on, would this be useful for an external API as well?
So in other words, calling an external server? Yes, absolutely. So we're using JSON server here, which is a local running server, but the idea is to approximate actually calling any remote API. And so I've used this for, yeah, I mean, that's exactly the idea. Is you're basically calling any REST service, which I believe the majority of any kind of server-side communication is done via, REST API. So this pattern, you can pick it up and please, take the source code and go make lots of money. I give you permission. I'll sign the release form. This is exactly what that's for, is if you're dealing with, some external API, we are just approximating that with JSON server because it's awesome.